In Rockingham County, North Carolina, 2012, a custody battle ended with an outcome no one expected. A respected father walked out of court defeated, and within days, his mother-in-law was discovered on the side of a rural road, barely alive. What happened between that courthouse ruling and the moment she was found would reveal years of hidden manipulation, betrayal, and a plan carried out with devastating consequences. Darius Whitfield as a man who carried himself with quiet consistency. At 36 years old, he had worked nearly a decade as a warehouse supervisor, a position that kept him away for long hours but gave him the stability he wanted for his young family. To those who lived near him, Darius was the dependable neighbor who shoveled snow without being asked, who waved at the school bus in the morning, and who was always the first to volunteer at community cookouts. He was not a man of flamboyance or flash, but of steady patterns that earned him trust. His devotion was most clearly seen in his role as a father. Darius's daughter, 7-year-old Alana, became the anchor of his daily life. Teachers remembered how he never missed parent-teacher meetings, often adjusting his shifts to sit in a classroom after a 12-hour day. Coaches recalled his presence on the sidelines, quietly encouraging Alana during soccer matches, never shouting but always visible. For Alana, he was the kind of father who showed up, who was present, and who placed her above everything else. At home, Darius and his wife, Keisha, maintained what outsiders perceived as a strong marriage. The couple had met years earlier, their relationship built on youthful affection rather than financial advantage. Darius was steady and hardworking, while Keisha was charismatic and socially connected. Their differences balanced in the early years, giving the impression of a household that functioned with care and order. The Whitfields were seen at church gatherings, school functions, and family events as a united pair raising their daughter together. From the beginning, the marriage between Darius Whitfield and Keisha Gaines carried a third presence that neither could avoid: Keisha's mother, Loretta Gaines. Loretta had lived much of her adult life cultivating status in Rockingham County, North Carolina. She was known for her expensive wardrobe, large gatherings at her home, and her habit of reminding others of the business ventures that had secured her wealth. Where Darius valued modest living, Loretta thrived on attention, and the two stood in constant contrast. Loretta made no attempt to hide her disapproval of her son-in-law. To her, Darius lacked both pedigree and ambition. He worked hard but carried no influence, no family name of prestige, and no sign of the affluence she desired for her daughter. Her friends recalled how she would roll her eyes when Darius's name came up, dismissing him as a warehouse man who'll never make more of himself. Behind these comments was a bitterness that dated back to before Keisha and Darius ever married. Years earlier, Keisha had been courted by Wendell Price, an older businessman with a reputation for generosity. Wendell, then in his mid-40s, had built a successful career in regional contracting and was financially secure. He made his interest in Keisha clear and, more importantly, won Loretta's approval by offering her gifts and assistance. He was considered by Loretta to be a man who could elevate her daughter's life, securing not only comfort but also status. When Keisha chose to marry Darius instead, Loretta felt her authority challenged and her preferences dismissed. That resentment never faded. Even after Keisha and Darius wed, Loretta spoke highly of Wendell in her daughter's presence, often comparing what might have been to the reality of her daughter's marriage. She positioned Wendell as the stable choice, the man who would have guaranteed Keisha a life of privilege, while Darius represented mediocrity. For Loretta, every shortcoming in Darius's life, whether it was a late bill or a long work shift, became evidence that Keisha had made the wrong choice. Inside the Whitfield household, this influence was deeply felt. Keisha began repeating her mother's criticisms, raising doubts about Darius's long hours at the warehouse, his inability to provide the kind of lifestyle she saw her friends enjoying, and his insistence on limiting Loretta's involvement in their family decisions. Arguments that began with routine matters often spiraled once Loretta's voice was introduced. What began as questions about household budgets or Alana's schooling turned into broader disputes about Darius's worth as a husband. Loretta also inserted herself directly into the marriage. She would arrive unannounced, offering her opinions on everything from parenting to finances. At times, she encouraged Keisha to spend nights at her home rather than remain in a house filled with arguments. At other times, she reminded Keisha of Wendell's continued presence, noting his success and the ease of life he provided for those around him. For Keisha, already worn down by the demands of her marriage, her mother's words began to carry weight. Darius, on the other hand, grew increasingly frustrated. He viewed Loretta as a divisive force whose interference was undermining his marriage. He urged Keisha to limit her mother's influence, but those requests only deepened the divide. To Keisha, the warnings sounded like attempts to isolate her from her family. To Darius, they were efforts to protect the stability of his household. The misalignment grew with each passing year. By early 2012, Loretta Gaines's disapproval of her son-in-law had grown into open hostility. She no longer limited herself to whispered criticisms or disapproving glances at family gatherings. Instead, she began considering how she could remove Darius Whitfield from her daughter's life entirely. Divorce, in her mind, was the only solution. To accomplish it, she devised a plan that would discredit him beyond repair. Central to that plan was Shanice Miller, one of Keisha Whitfield's closest friends. Shanice had known Keisha since high school, and over the years she had become a regular presence in the Whitfield household. Alana referred to her as Auntie Shanice, a reflection of how often she visited. This closeness made Shanice a natural choice for Loretta's scheme. Investigators would later uncover that Loretta first approached Shanice under the pretense of protecting Keisha. She told her that Darius was not the faithful husband he pretended to be and suggested that he only stayed in the marriage to maintain control over Keisha and Alana. Loretta offered Shanice money and promises of further financial help if she agreed to participate in a test of Darius's loyalty. The arrangement, as Loretta framed it, was simple: create a situation where Darius could be caught in an act that would confirm her suspicions. What Shanice was not told in full was that Loretta intended to escalate the plan beyond simple temptation. According to testimony that came out later, Loretta provided Shanice with substances to mix into Darius's drink, ensuring he would be disoriented and unable to resist once she made her advance. The instructions were precise: wait until Keisha was away for the evening, gain entry to the home as a trusted friend, and put the plan into motion. The night chosen was carefully selected. Keisha had plans that took her out of the house, and Darius was expected home late after a long shift. Shanice arrived earlier in the evening, waiting for him to settle in. When Darius returned, exhausted, she offered him a drink and engaged in casual conversation. Within minutes of consuming it, Darius began to feel the effects. Witnesses later described the video evidence as showing him dazed and unsteady, unable to fully comprehend what was happening around him. With Darius incapacitated, Shanice staged the compromising position exactly as Loretta had instructed. Items of clothing were deliberately misplaced, and the setting was arranged to remove any doubt of what appeared to be taking place. Loretta's final step was to ensure that her daughter walked into the house at precisely the right moment. She called Keisha, fabricating a reason to return home earlier than planned. The timing was exact. Within minutes of Shanice setting the stage, Keisha entered the house. What she saw was not the husband she believed in, but a scene of betrayal that appeared undeniable. The shock and rage that followed came as Loretta had anticipated. Shanice left quickly, leaving Keisha to confront her husband. For Darius, the disorientation left him unable to explain or defend himself. To Keisha, the explanation did not matter. The image was enough. She reacted as Loretta had predicted, demanding answers and accusing him of breaking their vows. In the days that followed, she filed for divorce, citing what she had witnessed as proof of his infidelity. Loretta's plan had succeeded. With one night carefully orchestrated, she had dismantled the trust between her daughter and son-in-law and positioned herself as the guiding voice in Keisha's next steps. Shanice, though complicit, would not reveal the truth at that time. She maintained her silence, bound by Loretta's influence and the money she had been given. The staged scene marked the turning point in the Whitfield marriage. From that moment forward, the family's image of stability was gone. What remained was a fractured household, a custody battle on the horizon, and a husband determined to prove that the night had been a setup. But the evidence was stacked against him, and Loretta had achieved what she set out to do: ruin Darius Whitfield in the eyes of his wife. For Darius, the fallout was devastating. He pleaded his innocence, insisting that the night had been a setup. He told Keisha he had no memory of willingly participating, that something had been put in his drink, and that Shanice's sudden presence was not an accident. But his protests carried little weight. Keisha had witnessed the scene herself, and soon after, a video surfaced showing enough to convince her that her husband had been unfaithful. Shanice, bound by her involvement in Loretta's plan, did not speak up. She allowed the narrative to continue unchallenged, leaving Darius isolated in his defense. The silence only deepened the sense of betrayal for Keisha, who now believed both her husband and her friend had conspired in secrecy. The marriage, once held together by years of shared life and the presence of a young daughter, collapsed under the weight of the staged evidence. By the time the divorce was finalized, the damage was permanent. The Whitfield marriage, once viewed as steady if imperfect, was gone. Keisha moved forward under the guidance of her mother, convinced she had made the right decision. Darius, left to navigate life as a divorced father, carried the weight of both humiliation and anger. He knew the truth of what had happened that night, but without Shanice's admission, it was his word against the manufactured evidence. In the months following the divorce filing, Darius Whitfield attempted to rebuild his life in fragments. He continued his work at the warehouse, tried to maintain regular contact with his daughter, and carried himself in public with quiet resolve. But beneath that exterior, the weight of what had happened pressed heavily. He insisted to anyone who would listen that he had been set up, yet without evidence, his words carried little power. Keisha refused to consider his explanations, and Loretta Gaines remained firmly in control of the narrative. The break in silence came not from Keisha or from the courts, but from Shanice Miller. For months, she had lived with the knowledge of her role in the scheme. She had accepted Loretta's payment, carried out the instructions, and allowed her best friend to believe a lie. But guilt has its limits, and by late 2012, Shanice could no longer carry the burden. She reached out to Darius privately, requesting a meeting. According to accounts provided later during interviews, Shanice admitted to him that Loretta had orchestrated the entire night. She confessed that she had been persuaded with money and promises of further support if she cooperated. She told him that the substances used to disorient him had come from Loretta directly, and that the video evidence had been deliberately staged. For Darius, the confession confirmed what he had suspected all along. The pieces fit too neatly for it to have been anything else. His sense of betrayal deepened, not only toward Loretta but also toward Shanice, who had been welcomed into his home and trusted around his daughter. He listened as Shanice described how she had been manipulated, how she had not been told the full extent of Loretta's plan, and how she regretted allowing herself to be used in a scheme that destroyed a family. But by the time Shanice came forward, the damage was irreversible. The divorce was already in motion, the court proceedings were underway, and Keisha had aligned herself completely with her mother. To present Shanice's admission at that stage would have been nearly impossible without corroborating evidence, and Darius understood that the confession, while validating, could not undo what had already been set in place. Shanice's decision to confess remained a private matter at first. She did not step forward publicly or to the court, fearing the consequences of admitting her role under oath. Instead, her disclosure remained between herself and Darius, a truth that clarified the betrayal but offered no immediate remedy. Darius was left to carry the knowledge alone, knowing that the foundation of his ruined marriage had been built on manipulation. The marriage was broken beyond repair, and the custody fight that followed would become the next battlefield. For both parents, the question of where their daughter would live became the central fight, overshadowing financial matters or property division. Each parent entered the courtroom determined to prove they were the best fit to provide Alana with stability and care. On paper, both parents presented compelling cases. Darius Whitfield had long been known as a devoted father. Teachers, coaches, and neighbors testified to his active presence in Alana's life. His argument was simple. Despite the breakdown of his marriage, his commitment as a father remained intact, and Alana's best interests would be served by staying with him. Keisha, on the other hand, emphasized stability. With support from her mother, Loretta Gaines, she argued that her home provided continuity and security that Darius, given his demanding work schedule and recent personal turmoil, could not match. She painted herself as the parent who could offer Alana a calmer environment, free from the tensions of the marriage. Loretta's presence in court reinforced this narrative. Positioned firmly at her daughter's side, she offered financial backing, a larger home, and assurances that Keisha would not face the challenges of single parenthood alone. The staged incident orchestrated months earlier quickly became a centerpiece of the proceedings. Keisha's legal team pointed to the video evidence and her testimony of what she had witnessed as proof that Darius's judgment and moral character were compromised. While no criminal charges had ever been filed in connection with the incident, the perception of infidelity cast a shadow over his case. Darius countered by insisting the event had been a setup, even mentioning Shanice Miller's later admission. But without Shanice present to testify formally, his claim was seen as unsupported and largely dismissed by the court. The presence of Loretta loomed over each session, her influence clear in the way proceedings unfolded. She not only provided financial resources for legal fees but also coordinated testimony to reinforce her daughter's case. When the decision was finally read, the tension in the room was palpable. The judge ruled that primary custody would remain with Keisha Whitfield. He acknowledged Darius's devotion as a father and granted him visitation rights, but he emphasized stability as the deciding factor. With Keisha supported by her mother and presenting a steady home environment, the court determined that Alana's long-term interests would be best served under her care. With the strike of the gavel, the battle for Alana was over. But for Darius, the war with his mother-in-law was only beginning. As the courtroom cleared, the atmosphere was charged. Keisha walked out supported by her mother, Loretta Gaines, who maintained the same composed confidence she had carried throughout the hearings. Darius followed not far behind, but outside the courthouse doors, composure gave way to confrontation. According to witnesses present that day, Darius approached Loretta directly, ignoring others around him. His focus was fixed on the woman he now knew had orchestrated the collapse of his marriage. He told her what Shanice Miller had confessed months earlier, that she had been paid, that the night of betrayal had been staged, and that Loretta had engineered every part of it. For the first time in public, he accused her openly of being the architect of his downfall. Those who overheard described Darius's voice as firm but strained, the tone of a man holding back anger while recounting months of betrayal. He spoke not only of Shanice's involvement but also of how Loretta had poisoned Keisha's trust and turned her against him. He laid out how his role as a father had been damaged not by his own choices but by her deliberate interference. Loretta's response was not defensive. Multiple accounts confirm that she remained calm, her expression cold, and her words dismissive. She denied nothing. Instead, she cut him off with a remark that would later be repeated in police reports and testimonies: "Do your worst, you son of nobody." The exchange lasted only minutes, but its impact was significant. For Darius, it was the moment Loretta transformed from a meddling in-law to an admitted adversary. Her refusal to acknowledge his pain, coupled with the taunt, struck at the very core of his identity. He had entered court believing he might salvage his role as a father. He left convinced that Loretta had stripped him of everything. Keisha stood nearby during the confrontation, attempting to move her mother away from the situation. She did not intervene directly, but her alignment was clear. She left the courthouse with Loretta at her side, leaving Darius standing alone in the parking lot. For those observing, it was an image of a man isolated not only by the court's decision but by the combined force of his wife and mother-in-law against him. On a late October night in 2012, the tension that had been building for months reached its breaking point. According to investigators, Darius Whitfield drove to his mother-in-law's residence in Rockingham County and waited outside in the darkness. The neighborhood was quiet, most of the homes already asleep. Witnesses later reported seeing his vehicle parked along the road at an unusual hour, though none recognized at the time what was about to unfold. Shortly after Loretta Gaines returned home alone, Darius made his move. Reports confirm that he confronted her as she exited her vehicle. The confrontation was brief and forceful. Neighbors recalled hearing a muffled cry, but no one called authorities that night. Loretta was overpowered and forced into Darius's car. Within minutes, he had driven away, leaving behind little more than the sound of tires fading into the distance. Darius did not drive back to his home. Instead, he headed out of the county and across the state line into a more isolated stretch of land where his father's old cabin sat hidden by trees and unpaved roads. The drive lasted nearly an hour, long enough to ensure they were far removed from anyone who might intervene. Investigators would later confirm his movements through traffic cameras and witness sightings along rural roads. At the cabin, the night took a darker turn. Evidence presented during trial indicated that Darius restrained Loretta inside the structure. He tied her hands, preventing her from leaving, and made it clear she was not there by accident. What followed, by his own later admission, was a night intended as retaliation. He told investigators that he wanted Loretta to experience the same humiliation he believed she had orchestrated against him. For hours, he subjected her to degrading acts of revenge. The specific details of those acts were documented in court records but described in careful terms due to their nature. What was clear is that Darius used the night to assert control, reversing the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for years. He admitted that his goal was not only to punish her but to break her spirit, the same way he believed she had broken his marriage. By the early morning hours, Loretta was physically weakened. The combination of restraint, prolonged abuse, and stress left her unable to resist. Darius later told detectives that he stopped only when he felt she no longer had strength left. At that point, he untied her, forced her back into the car, and drove her toward Rockingham County. Rather than return her to her home, Darius chose a stretch of road less than a mile from her residence. He left her there, injured and exhausted, abandoning her on the side of the road before driving back toward the cabin. His expectation, as he later admitted, was that someone would find her, but he showed no concern for her medical condition. At approximately 7 a.m., a passerby spotted Loretta lying near the roadside and called 911. Emergency responders arrived quickly, finding her alive but in critical condition. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but the complications of the night proved fatal. Within hours of being admitted, Loretta Gaines was pronounced dead. The abduction marked the point where a bitter family dispute crossed into violent crime. For years, Darius had fought Loretta with words, in-laws, and courtroom battles. That night, he escalated to force, ensuring the conflict would end not with mediation or custody rulings, but with a death that shocked the county. By the afternoon of October 28, 2012, investigators had traced the sequence of events that ended with Loretta Gaines's death back to one man, her son-in-law, Darius Whitfield. Tire impressions from the roadside matched his vehicle. Witnesses placed him in the area the night before. And when officers pieced together his history with Loretta, including the confrontation outside the courthouse just days earlier, the evidence pointed in one direction. Deputies traveled to the remote cabin passed down from Darius's father, located in a wooded area across the county line. Surveillance confirmed his car was parked on the property. Officers approached cautiously but found no need for force. Darius surrendered without resistance, stepping outside when ordered and allowing himself to be handcuffed. There were no attempts to flee, no denials shouted in protest. He complied as though the outcome had already been accepted. At the sheriff's office, detectives began interrogation. It did not take long for Darius to admit to what he had done. He confirmed that he abducted Loretta, tied her at the cabin, and left her on the roadside. He told investigators that his actions were driven by anger over years of sabotage and manipulation. He cited Shanice Miller's confession, repeating her admission that Loretta had paid her to stage the incident that ended his marriage. He described Loretta as the architect of his downfall, a woman who had taken pride in destroying his life and separating him from his daughter. The confession was detailed but carried no remorse. Darius framed his actions as retaliation, explaining that he wanted Loretta to experience humiliation the way he had. Investigators noted his tone as calm, matter-of-fact, as though he were explaining the inevitable outcome of years of conflict. The case moved swiftly to trial. Prosecutors built their argument around the abduction, the evidence of restraint, and the fatal outcome. Medical testimony confirmed that Loretta's death was the result of complications directly tied to the assault and trauma of that night. Witnesses connected Darius to the area and described his withdrawal in the days leading up to the crime. The staged betrayal was introduced, but prosecutors argued that even if manipulation had occurred, it did not excuse his actions. The defense leaned heavily on the years of provocation and manipulation. Attorneys pointed to Shanice's eventual admission as proof that Loretta had orchestrated a scheme to frame Darius. They argued that the emotional weight of losing his marriage and custody of his daughter drove him into a state of desperation. But the jury was unmoved. While they acknowledged the toxic family dynamic, they concluded that Darius had crossed a line from victim to perpetrator. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree kidnapping, sexual assault, and second-degree murder. The sentencing was severe, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The court recognized the years of conflict that had preceded the crime but determined that nothing justified the level of violence inflicted. For Keisha, the aftermath carried its own torment. In the months following the trial, she learned of Shanice Miller's confession in full detail, how her mother had engineered the staged incident, paid her friend, and manipulated her perception of her husband. The truth revealed that her marriage had collapsed not because of Darius's betrayal but because of Loretta's interference. Yet the revelation offered no relief. Darius's actions had taken her mother's life and left her daughter without a father. Friends described Keisha as conflicted, torn between the man she had once loved and the mother who had shaped her decisions. She carried the knowledge that her mother's schemes had set the tragedy in motion, but she could not reconcile the brutality of Darius's response. The marriage was long over, and the family that remained was fractured beyond repair. For the community, the case closed with a grim recognition. A family feud had escalated into one of the most shocking crimes Rockingham County had seen in years. What began with manipulation inside a marriage ended in a violent act that destroyed 3 generations at once. A mother, a husband, and a daughter caught in the middle. The image of a perfect family had been shattered, not by chance, but by a chain of betrayal, retaliation, and tragedy that left behind no winners, only lasting scars.